This is my walkthrough of the assignment that I asked you to do involving the rhetorical moves. Before I start, I wanted to first mention that this is not an easy assignment, even for native speakers. So if you had trouble going through it, don't worry. The idea is that you're looking for these rhetorical moves when you read the paper, whatever paper you end up finding for yourself, and then also being able to use them yourself when you write your own paper. So the response I have here isn't necessarily the only response. There will most likely be things that I leave out. If it's different from what you ended up with, that's okay. This is just kind of for your reference, and hopefully it'll help you look at how I interpreted the paper. I divided the first section up into 3, and then I assigned it to all of you. And I did a close reading of this one already, although I didn't use the Rhetorical Moves. I'll use the same Rhetorical Moves website that I showed you to do this analysis again, so you can take a look at what that would look like. So she starts the paper broadly talking about L2 literacy, which is something within second language acquisition, which is quite broad as a field. She's narrowing down the different views. There's psycholinguistic views and so on, and then other research. So she's kind of narrowing it down until she gets to here, and that would be an example of framing, and I would recommend that you use the full website instead of looking at here. She's looking at literacy within this framework of literacy, new literacy studies. And people who have studied that would know, for example, if you've taken digital literacies, you might have heard of this term, or at least seen some of these authors, and you would then know that she is locating her research within this framework. And then she goes on defining what this is, right? Where she says where literacy is intimately bound up in social cultural context. So this would be defining. So she's defining a particular way of looking at literacy and indicating to the reader that this is how she will be approaching it. Here's another example. She's kind of, this is part of her defining. She is defining literacy in multiple forms, because literacy used to be something that is considered reading and writing. And in the new literacy's definition, it's more than that. It's not just reading and writing, but it's also reading and writing within different settings between different people, so that when you're writing a paper, it's different from when you're writing a letter or writing an email, and so on. These are the expanded views of literacies that she is drawing on. So there might be more stuff going on there, so I'm not going to go through all of them. So same is true, I'm not going to go through them exhaustively, but I do want to just kind of highlight the key things. Phrases like this is really helpful, because again, this is part of the defining and framing part, when she's saying from this point of view. So again, this is further framing. She's saying from this point of view, this is what literacy looks like. Here's more of a definition. She's saying that any act of reading and writing is influenced by the institutional setting. So this is more defining. And she is also, of course, anytime she's citing people, she is doing authorizing as well. It helps when you know who these people are. So again, if you've taken the digital literacies class, like G is someone who people who know the field would know. She does more of that here. Again, more authorizing and defining it according to how G is defining it. This, could probably consider this as part of illustrating. This is G's illustration, but it is a form of illustration. Of course, anytime she does an expanded quote here, it would be authorizing. Just a side note, when you write your own paper, I don't want there to be too many extended quotes, and people try to fill their papers with so many other quotes that it doesn't even sound like their paper voice anymore, and it's a way of writing less. And also, you would notice that even in her writing, she uses very little direct quotes, and just something to keep in mind. Okay, so this is more of a definition. Okay, so here she's using an important word, however. So we can take a look at some of the other rhetorical moves and see what it might look at. Although noting the heterogeneity of discourse does not address. So she's here indicating a gap, which to me sounds like there are gaps, right? So this would be uncovering values. And when you see that, they're saying, how is her research going to be different from other kinds of research? And by implication, why do you want to read it? She does a bit more of framing here. She's framing it within the post-structuralist framework. Also more framing and defining. I think these two always go hand in hand, typically because you are trying to limit your definition and then you usually follow that with a specific definition. So you should probably, if you come across a lot of these, that would make sense. Before I move on, I just wanted to look at the other rhetorical moves. So she did a little bit of countering. She didn't do arguing the other side. Borrowing, extending, and synthesizing. I would say there's some synthesizing, although I don't think she really gets to that yet. Although wait, she hints at it because she's talking about G. She hints that she's going to do something to combine them, which would be synthesizing, but she hasn't done that yet. So we haven't seen a lot of this just yet, although I think we'll see more of that soon. So let's move on to this section. But just to back up a little bit, in the introduction, typically in all research papers, the author is usually trying to explain to the reader where they are coming from, where they are approaching, or how they're approaching the topic. So from the different rhetorical moves, you will expect to see a lot of grounding, but also the other ones, and probably more so than the other parts of the paper, because that's when you would describe your research process and talk about your findings. So this would be, you will see a lot of rhetorical moves in this first part of the paper, which is why I assigned this. So let's move on. So here, I think, we see more of her trying to do kind of the background stuff in terms of grounding the reader in a particular framework. She starts up broad again. She again goes back to kind of broadly L2 literacy. If you remember, she does the same thing here. So she's kind of starting broad, and then she's going to start narrowing it down. Here she picking an example of one of these theories. So I think this is when she's going to start doing some of this type of work, because she's trying to talk about how her work is different from others. So this might not be the best way to describe it. So I would say actually a lot of this part would be, I guess all this would be kind of framing, in the sense that she is trying to distinguish her work from these different ways of looking at research. I think here we can probably sense that she is about to do some authorizing, just because she's going to talk about voice, and that's a good way of hinting. I think they definitely do talk about voices up here as well, but here she is framing, authorizing, and also kind of defining her particular way of looking at voice as something, as what Cramsch uses. So this is defining, obviously this is defining as well. Again, more authorizing. Now she's doing something nested here, because she's saying Cramsch defined it according to Goffman. So there's more, more defining, more framing. She's also trying to define different ways that Goffman uses it. So it's Cramsch defining Goffman. So it's Lamb defining Goffman through Cramsch. So again, this is more defining. Definitely, this part. Like I said before, I'm going this really broadly because I'm going through the whole section, and I don't want this video to end up being too long that you won't look at it. So I'm kind of I'm not going as deeply, I just wanted to capture the kind of the key things. This is more defining and authorizing, because again, this is still Goffman. This is more defining. Just to step back a little, when she's doing this, and when she's spending a lot of time talking about a particular thing, you should kind of pay attention. So we haven't talked about borrowing. So in this case, it is Cramsch borrowing Goffman, right? And so what she's indicating is also to say that she is possibly going to borrow Goffman, although she hasn't really stated that explicitly yet. Now here is another person that she's going to bring into the into her framework. Again, more defining. Again, if this is if you've taken digital literacies with me, these names, maybe not Cress, but if you took digital literacies with me, you should remember Cope and Calance's, and Cress is part of the New London group. So she's the Rhetorical Moves is for a lot of audiences, people who know the field really well and know what she's trying to do. But even if you don't, it doesn't matter. You know that you should be able to sense these things. And she mentions post-structure theories, which you already talked about. These are more ways of her talking about what they have done and building on their theories. Now, we haven't talked about it like extending and synthesizing, because right now she's still building on other people's work. She's not transforming. I think extending involves building on and transferring. So she hasn't really done that yet. Although I think she will soon. I'd say there's more authorizing in that she is talking a lot about Cress's approach to design, and she's going into quite detailed, because not surprisingly, because that is the title. She's going to talk about design and the self, and she's going to explain those things really clearly. Also, at this point, I also should mention that when you read, you should pay attention to what writers mean when they use certain words. So words like design, words like self, these are words that we hear and use every day. But it's important when you do research, you mean it in a specific way, and you shouldn't get them mixed up. If they're terms that are related, then you should kind of talk about that they're related. You come across a lot of theorists who kind of talk about the same thing, and they really mean the same thing. So that comes from understanding the field a little bit better, which is what your literature review, part of what that process is for, is to understand the field and to know when you use the word design, when you use the word self, whatever keywords that you end up using, those are words that are important and significant and unique in that particular use, which is why she spends a lot of time defining it. She's not. She's trying to say, I'm putting my research into this particular field, and she is building it on this body of work. So she's talked about design, and then now she's going to talk about computer mediated communication. This type of breaking down using subheadings is really helpful from a reader's point of view. So when you write on paper, and especially if you are combining different frameworks, then you should make sure that you use these subheadings. Now, I just said that they were that she is combining two or more claims. So she's definitely about to do that, just from the way that she is dividing her paper, although she doesn't state that in her paper yet. But she's drawing on. So so far we've looked at Goffman, we've looked at Kress, and we've looked at Cramsch, and she's covered these things. So now she's gonna talk about computer media communication, which, even if you don't know anything about second language acquisition, you'll know that computer media communication is a completely different field. So here's already an indication she's about to do some kind of synthesizing. But first, she wants to establish that field first. She's gonna start with defining what she considers, or what is counted as computer media communication. One big reason why she's doing it here, of course, is that this is published in a TESOL journal for ESL educators, I guess. And so these educators won't necessarily know anything about computer media communication, so it's important to define it for them. So that would be one big reason to do that. So she's doing a lot more defining here. And again, she's drawing on connecting here. I think she's about to do some synthesizing, because now she's trying to connect Goffman. You can probably say she's starting to do borrowing. She's definitely done more borrowing up there as well. I don't think I identified every single instance, which is fine. You might have come up with more, and that would probably be more accurate. More defining, because I know that this is a very important part of her paper. One way that's kind of easy to help figure out when defining is happening is when they use something like this, like in Goffman's terms. You know that she's also kind of doing authorizing, right? She is building on the authority of Goffman, and Goffman is a very famous sociologist. So she's kind of building on very solid foundation. I think I might have mentioned that in the close reading video. This is more defining. This is more defining of how Goffman talks about the self. And now she's going back to CMC, and then she's going to talk about community as a metaphor within CMC. So she is defining, and here she's kind of, again, doing that thing where she talks about, the broad ways that it's been used. Here she's given an example, although this is, I think it's illustrating, right? And here, illustrating, in this case, she's trying to show one example of how someone has used community, CMC, asynchronous communication in this context. So she gives one example here, and she gives another example here. So this is her literature review, which you'll have to write one. And a lot of times, and you'll see that in the textbook reading when we get to this part, a lot of times when people write literature reviews, they will do, the entire literature review would consist of this, where you talk about one author and you talk about another author, and then you keep doing that throughout the entire paper without kind of adding anything to it. Here she's only doing it briefly, although she's obviously citing from other people up here, she's elaborating on it. And so when you write your literature review, make sure you do that. You have a assignment to do an annotated bibliography, which would be this. This would be an annotated bibliography where you just basically list all the main findings without necessarily synthesizing them. And that's fine for the annotated bibliography assignment, but when you write your literature review, you should transform it into a literature review, which is not the same as an annotated bibliography. That's why I asked you to do both, because I want to make sure that those two are very different. If your literature review just looks exactly like your annotated bibliography, then that means something went wrong. So I just wanted to bring that up, because every now and then it is okay to kind of talk about a series of studies like this just for the purpose of illustrating. But it's not okay if your literature review is only a list of, unconnected studies. Going back to her paper, here she is. She's doing defining, she's doing, I guess, also illustrating. Yeah, she's elaborating on this a little bit more. And here she's giving an extended example. She's actually spending quite a bit of time talking about this example, this approach. when you write your literature review, if you find a study that is very important, important either because it's cited a lot or important to you because you think it's important, it's okay to spend a bit of time on it like she is doing. It's because she's giving a very specific example that uses IRC. Just kind of keep in mind this is this is written in the year 2000. I don't know if you know IRC. It's pretty old technology, old by today's standards. She's talking more about she's giving more illustrating. And I wanted to mention this because she is probably giving this more detail because of the audience who are not familiar with CMC, who might not know what IRC is, who might not know what chatting is and all this stuff. This is probably why this is. So that's something to keep in mind. You can also consider these are more illustrating. So I think here she's doing something important because of the audience, she is trying to talk about what constitutes a self in an online context, right? And so she is trying to frame that within a CMC context. This is a unique way of looking at the self in an online context. She's doing more framing, some defining. I know I said this before, but I want to just say that again. I'm not going through this sentence by sentence again because I don't want to make this into a very long video. So I'm kind of doing the key parts. But basically, every single sentence in your paper should have a rhetorical move, because you don't want any sentence in there that doesn't serve a purpose. When you write your paper, you should think carefully about every single sentence you include there, because when you write something, you are putting a burden on the reader. You're saying, here, this sentence I wrote is worth reading. And if it's just there to fill up space, then you're not making good use of the reader's time, which in this case would be my time. But more importantly, you should make sure that every single sentence serves a purpose. If it doesn't serve a purpose, if it doesn't serve at least one of these, I think there's a slide that has all of them, at least one of these, then most likely that sentence is just a waste of space. One of the things for this class is to write good papers, good academic papers, good research papers, and you should make sure that your own paper does that. Oftentimes, there are a lot of sentences that are just filling up space. It doesn't really serve a purpose. They say stuff that are very obviously true. Like, just as an example, like, education is very important. Yes, that's a sentence that is true. No one can disagree with that. It doesn't serve any of those purposes, so make every sentence count. Okay, end of rant. Ironically, she says, well, maybe not ironically, but she's talking about rhetorical device, which is what we are doing, so we're kind of being a bit meta here. I missed this, but obviously anytime you see, for example, she is illustrating. I guess this is authorizing. And I guess defining this phenomenon according to Weary. She's doing some illustrating here by giving an example, and also kind of just making the argument how, even though IRC, again, I don't know if you know IRC. IRC is this chat before chat existed, synchronous chat, which is typed. So that's what she meant by written. There are oral discourse features, which means people use like what she doesn't talk about here, but emoticons, that type of thing, or abbreviations, which she talks about, like LOL or whatever. These are aspects of verbal language that are transformed into written language. So there's kind of a hybrid modality there when people are chatting. Just to back up one quick second, she talked about self, she talked about CMC. Now she's about to do what I kind of expect her to do, is she's about to do some forwarding, which involves, in this case, she's going to do all of these, I would say. this whole part when she does Goffman, Gramsci, Kress, kind of CMC, she is synthesizing all their work because they don't really write in the same area. Goffman died before the internet. She's doing basically all of this by borrowing on their work and saying how she's going to apply to it in this unique context. She's done a lot of defining before, but now she's explicitly saying how she, Lamb's the author, her defining it. And then here she says, this is kind of introducing the next part of the paper. This is clearly extending. Extending is when you build and transform another claims and methodology. So saying she's using an expanded vision in the age of a global electronic community. She's taking literacy research and global communications and then kind of combining it. Just to step back real quickly, because this video is already quite long. I didn't go through every single sentence to look at all the different moves, but I try to highlight all the main ones. Hopefully you were able to do a lot of the same things and see how she does all these different moves within her paper to build her framework. And that's basically what a literature review is for, because a literature review is to say, you have this topic and you are analyzing this topic through different people's lenses, which involves defining, authorizing, illustrating. This is one way to remove bias, because you're not just looking at something from your personal opinion. You're saying you're understanding a phenomenon through a particular framework, a particular theoretical framework. That is what most of the literature review is about. It's talking about the field, but also talking about how you are approaching it, because any phenomenon can be studied in any number of ways, right? Because you can do a survey, you can do an interview, you can do a case study, you can do any number of things to study any situation. Why you need to do the rhetorical moves is to explain to the reader, why are you doing it this way? Why did you do it this way instead of that way? That's where you would kind of build a lot of a framework to say, previous people have done it this way, and this is where I'm coming from. So I hope this has been helpful. Again, the reason is to make sure that you understand how papers are written, and also how to read it, and how to write your own paper, keeping these rhetorical moves in mind, making sure that you use them throughout your paper so that every sentence is meaningful and worth something, worth reading. And also, this is part of the research process in that you avoid bias, to avoid kind of letting your personal views get in the way. It's important to situate your work into frameworks and say, this is how you're going to study something, not coming from your own personal definition of something, but from a definition that other people have identified and found important. And I'm looking forward to see what you've done.